Hi everyone, my name is Fiona Russell. I'm the manager of the Faculty of Health Library Services at Deakin Uni, and I'm also on the organising group for this combined CRIG PDIG Forum, which is Our Future, Diversified or Diluted. Just to begin with, on behalf of Cabal and the CRIG and PDIG committees, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands across Australia and New Zealand where we live, learn and work. We acknowledge and celebrate the inherent strengths of Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and other First Nation peoples and communities, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, sky and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So welcome to this webinar in the Biennial Joint Forum presented by Cabal Research and Information Group, which is otherwise known as CRIG, and the Professional Development Interest Group, otherwise known as PDIG. This year, the webinar series is called Our Future, Diversified or Diluted. If you have any technical questions during the presentation, please type your question into the chat and the Cabal team will assist you. Please use the hashtag CabalDOD when commenting on social media during or after the webinar. Today's three presenters are Trish Hepworth, Director of Policy and Education at the Australian Library and Information Association, Philip Kent, University Librarian at the University of Sydney, and Kristy Newton, Digital Literacies Coordinator at the University of Wollongong. The speakers will assist us in furthering the discussion started by the launch of the ALIA Professional Pathways in late 2020, and we will try to unpack what it means to be a library professional in the 2020s. If you have questions for the speakers throughout the session, please ask them through the Slido link, which we have added to the chat and rotating slides. Alternatively, you can also go to slido.com or the Slido app and use the event code 691673. The event will conclude with a question and answer session with the three speakers. So without further ado, I'll pass on to Trish. Thank you, Trish.
Thank you. I will just, okay, there we are. Just make my screen go sharing. Okay, have I convincingly actually managed to share that? That will be a first ever.
Yep, sure have.
Excellent. Well, thank you all very much for inviting me along today. I am calling in from the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, where it is beautiful and sunny today after a foggy morning. It's the lands on which I was born, and I pay my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri elders. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Thank you, as I said, very much for inviting me along today. Seeing as we were going to continue the conversation that we've kicked off with ALIA's Professional Pathways, I was very happy to come along, and also a little bit worried because it's always that difficult thing of judging how many people have actually bothered or have seen some of this and how many people haven't. So I apologise if I cover a little bit of old ground for people, but I thought we'll do a bit of an overview so that we are all on the same base to kick off the rest of the discussion today. And being a bit of a provocateur, I guess, I have to admit I took issue a little bit with the title, the sort of diversified or diluted framing of this, which almost suggested that diversity or the labelling around diversity was a cover for something that was seeking to dilute or water down the library and information profession. And I think that is fundamentally not the right way to be looking at things. And I think if anybody goes and has a look at the research around diversity, everything from women on boards through to ensuring that we actually increase the representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people within workforces. There are huge strengths that come from diversity, and the thought of dilution is actually a very problematic one, especially when viewed through racial lenses. So there's just my little caveat that says I'm about to bang on about the benefits around diversity and why it's actually quite important as we go forwards. And so because I was in a little bit of a grr mood around that, I guess, I thought I'd throw at you some of these sort of slides that I am sure you have all seen before, but they have a look at what our current library and information workforce is. And this slide here has the last three data points, 2006, 2011, 2016. And this is just one aspect, which is having a look at younger workers in the workforce. So the first three colours you'll see then, the dark blues, librarians, and orange is gallery, library, and museum technicians. The grey is library assistants. So that, I guess, would be encapsulating a huge amount of the workforce. And you will see that over the last couple of years, in fact, the percentage of, say, librarians who are in that age range of 20 to 39 has dropped from 24% down to 21%, against a national average of about 47% of the workforce being in that category. This is me blowing it up just to show how stark that difference is. Looking at gender, I think it's not a surprise to anybody that the LIS workforce is a highly feminised workforce, which, you know, it does bring a huge amount of strengths, but is, again, also lacks some of that strength that you get from diversity. You'll see there that we've been tracking in the mid-80s for female representation within the LIS workforce over the last umpteen years, and in fact over the last several decades. And then looking at another aspect today, so it's difficult to measure sometimes ethnic diversity, but one way to do it is to look at people who grew up in a household that spoke a language other than English. And across the workforce, we see that around a fifth of the Australian population, or a fifth of the Australian workforce, grew up in households that spoke languages other than English as their primary language. And we're sitting at about 10%, so about half of that within the library and information workforce. We also know that from recent work that ALIA has been doing that has not been released yet, unfortunately, we are probably looking at having well under 1% of our workforce as identifying as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. And so we are not a hugely diverse profession at the moment. At the same time as not being a hugely diverse profession, we have hugely diverse collections, and we are servicing hugely diverse populations. So looking particularly, say, for the Australian university library sector, even with the slight hiccups around international students that I'm sure everyone is very well aware of on this call, we know that we've got a huge percentage of students that come who were born overseas, a huge percentage of students that speak languages other than English. We have a higher proportion of students who identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander than we do in the library services that support them. We also have collections within university libraries that both were created by very diverse communities and research on very diverse communities. And often this is older research that was done without the ethical framework or the permissions that we would think were important and prerequisites nowadays. So we've got hugely diverse users and clients, customers, people that we serve, communities. We've got hugely diverse collections, and we've got emerging challenges. So I've just thrown up this slide here, which came out of the ALIA online conference at the beginning of this year, looking at Indigenous Australian sovereignties within the library sector. And it's very clear that we still have a huge amount of work to do for proper reconciliation and proper engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and the knowledge of how best to manage the collection and revise historical collections. That ALIA online conference also pulled up giant questions around AI, called data governance, privacy and copyright, access and control, huge ethical and practical questions that the library and information services are being asked to think about. So I guess that's a little bit of the framing that we're coming to this. So two of the things that sort of have set up the entire ALIA Professional Pathways project have been the recognition that despite the fact that we long ago identified diversity of our workforce as an issue, things actually haven't changed over the last 2 decades, 3 decades. And an acknowledgement that we have emerging challenges that we need a diversity of skills and a diversity of people in order to address. And so the underlying logic proposition that has for the entire professional pathways is that if we have an LIS workforce that reflects the diversity of society, that is equipped with the right skills, is valued, and as part of that is understood and is supported, that workforce will be the best place to deliver quality library and information services that anticipate and meet the needs of the population. So there's my sort of introductory blurb. What does Professional Pathways then do? Well, this is the boring slide, which is the plan in dot points. There are a couple of key things that we're looking to do. We're looking to revise and clarify that core of LIS professional skills, knowledge and ethical practice. So ethics is one of the things that has really come through strongly in our consultations, where people have really felt that while bringing people without, say, traditional qualifications in library and information studies has been beneficial in many circumstances, there is a huge issue when they don't understand the underlying ethics that support the entire library and information services. We are looking at actively not just recognising that diversity is an issue, but working on better pathways that will support more diverse candidates to come into the profession. We are also looking at increasing pathways within the profession. So, and that's part of the feedback around people feeling that you start on one track and then they're almost bonded to a particular institution or a particular kind of role, and that sometimes the profession hasn't been as good at recognising transferable skills in and without the profession. We need to work with our education providers to make sure that we've got strong education products that come in, so our grad dips and master's degrees, and also other products to support PD, such as micro-credentials and short courses. Moving to look at the active profession centred on lifelong learning, and most of all, do some excellent whiz-bang communication so that we are really clear on our core skills and value proposition, and the rest of the world is clear on that as well. The bit of this, I guess, that has inspired the most chatter, thought, discussion, sometimes heated, sometimes not, would be about the pathways into the profession. So at the moment, there are two main pathways to go into an academic library and be recognised as a library professional. And they would be to go through VET and come through with a diploma and be a library technician, or to go through and do either a Masters of Education in Teacher Librarianship for school libraries, or go through and do a grad dip or a Masters in Library and Information Science and come through it recognised as an associate member of ALIA or a librarian. Professional Pathways is really looking at strengthening, at introducing a new entry point right at the entry level and strengthening or increasing pathways at that professional end. That entry level one, the library traineeship, to be honest, I'm not sure how much that would be of interest to the academic library sector. It is mainly something that has come through our work with the public library sector, and it's looking at having sort of a certificate level or sort of high, somebody who has left school and has not done further training, an entry pathway for them to come into the library services. Whereas the information professional one is looking at what are the ways that we can make sure we've got people coming in at the level where they have professional level skills in library and information. Oh, this is a really boring slide. I apologise for giving you this exciting thing. If anyone wants to see what my mad next couple of years look like, it's this slide. In more important things, we are looking at having the traineeship in place by the beginning of next year. So that's a fairly big one. And then by May next year, we will be looking at having the optional pathways into becoming an information professional. Now, what do those optional pathways look like? What on earth am I talking about, full stop? So at the moment, I am knee-deep in looking at the 20 million quadrillion different frameworks that people have made over the years about what are the core competencies for library and information professionals. And I'd like to give out a great shout to Caval here, because there is a fantastic document from a couple of years ago where some very kind souls pulled together all of the frameworks they could find for academic libraries and put them all in a document. And since then, there have been even more. And if you look overseas, there are even more. So what we are looking at the moment is through a process of consultations with people and all of the work that has already been done, because I've got no desire to reinvent the wheel, trying to clarify what actually are those foundation knowledge, what are the core things of technical skills, what are the core ethical practices that everybody must attain to, and what are the essential cross-disciplinary skills. And we are shaping that up. And then once we have that, the question is, well, how do people attain that? And traditionally, the way to do that has obviously been through the graduate diploma or the master's degree option. What we are looking at doing is following other organisations. I would love to say we are a leader in this, by the way, but honestly, we are following other organisations such as the Australian Society of Archivists in Australia, or our sister organisations such as LIANSA in New Zealand and SILIP in the UK, at saying, well, what are the other pathways? And those other pathways can include things like on-the-job training. They can practice by doing short courses, registered training, all of those sort of different aspects, and giving people a structure in which they can map their existing knowledge through those different sort of micro credentials, on the job training, everything else, map those against the core competencies, identify the gaps, and work out how to get to plug those with either micro credentials or doing 1 or 2 courses at a university or finding some more on the job training, and then being able to present themselves as library and information professionals. Alongside that, we also know that there are certain disciplines where there is additional competencies that are required, or people who may not even necessarily wish to pick up all of a central library and information specialisation, but do want to be able to demonstrate that they have the information management skills, for example, in data management, or in a health library specialisation, or in a law library specialisation. And so we're looking at the frameworks to support those as well, also including specific training that goes through those. And then the other huge part of this is that ongoing active professionalism. So at the moment, if you are a member of ALIA, you automatically get enrolled in our PD scheme because we are so kind and we know that you all love to spend your lives doing PD. We're looking at rescoping the PD scheme and making sure that, again, though the links between the professional development that you do and the core competencies and the specializations are much clearer, to be able that everyone can sort of produce a lovely document and know within their own selves that they are actually ticking off on those core things and having a really positive experience of continuing professional development, because things change. And, you know, if you graduated 20 years ago, the chances that you really tackled Indigenous sovereignties, for example, in your coursework are not high. So we need to make sure that we have a structure that both encourages and supports people to continue that professional development and really take ownership of your own professional career and your own professional responsibilities. So here's the other cheerful slide. This is what we're aiming for: a diverse, skilled, valued and supported workforce delivering quality library and information services. That was our very quick overview. I am very much looking forward to hearing from everybody else and tackling some really gnarly questions. Thank you. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Trish. Yeah, lots there for us to think about. I'd now like to hand over to Philip to provide his perspectives on changing employment opportunities. Thank you, Philip.
Good, and hello everyone. It's nice to see some familiar faces, and it's also nice to be back involved with Caval after a few years away. So yes, I also shared Trish's sort of concerns about the title, but I just decided to ignore it. And we can come to some of those sorts of gnarly questions in the Q&A session later. Next slide, please. And I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners. I'm coming to you today from Gadigal land of the Aurora Nation at the University of Sydney. And I pay my respects to those who have cared and continue to care for the beautiful country that I'm on here in Sydney today, with lovely blue skies and lovely green lawn, and where the Fisher Library is, that you can see in my background, is right beside Kangaroo Ground. So next slide, please. I'm just really going to focus on some sectoral challenges, sort of more high level sorts of things, but I think it's quite nice flowing on from Trish talking about the profession as a whole to talking a bit more about higher education. I'm going to talk about some learnings from my recent work experience in the UK, and also some starter ideas, I guess, on future work. And then we can return to the professional pathways issues and how all this joins together during question time. Next slide, please. So we've had a bit of a fun time in the last year or so. And due to the global pandemic, we have all scaled up and down our services. We've been innovative in providing retrieval and postage services, sort of old school in terms of librarianship, I guess, but absolutely necessary. We've all escalated our online chat services. We've pushed our online collections and services to the limit. And we've also helped to reset the clock in some institutions about this print versus electronic question. Almost all libraries in higher ed in Australia have suffered funding restrictions, and primarily due to the loss of international student numbers, but there's a whole lot of other factors that have meant that budgets are in a certain shape at this time, which has generally resulted in across the board cuts. Recently, I chaired a group of 8 meeting on workforce changes, and all of my colleagues reported a mix of voluntary and involuntary redundancy programs, recruitment freezes, collection cuts, and other austerity measures as a result of reduced university income in the short and long term. We've all redefined our business and our services, and I guess my point here is that, you know, I think we've made so many changes in the last year that it's hard to sort of think about, you know, would we go back to the jobs that we had in the past, you know, or will they all be different? And certainly we've also suffered a bit of a pipeline effect. So the first years that we've lost also mean that you've lost second years next year and third years in the year after. So it really is, I think, suggesting that it's not just a one-year issue. We're going to have several years of austerity. We've all been making the most of our workforce during the last year, and we've had to redefine some jobs, even if it's just in an urgency situation, or in some cases, we've had to really just roll our sleeves up and all hands on deck. And I think about sharing around what work is most immediate, and just a practical example where some of my colleagues have switched to doing much more digitisation than shelving. But this isn't all that new either. Just in the pre-COVID year in the UK, there was problems with, it was due to the age, it was a demographic thing, that there were much fewer 18-year-olds, and that then reduced the number of students coming in, and there was a lot more competition between universities. And I can't help but think about my colleague at the University of Portsmouth, who basically said, we just have to throw away all our PDs. It was all roll your sleeves up. And what we've all done in recent years, which has created a lot more specialist jobs, that sort of went out the window at Portsmouth and other universities in the UK. And basically everyone just had to lend a hand for the most urgent priorities. So we go to the next slide, and this is sort of thinking a bit more, not just about the environment that we're in, the national environment, but also within our own sector. And people talk about the corporatisation of universities and how that's changed. Some people refer to it as the McDonaldisation, if that's a word, of universities. And it goes back to this whole drive from the government to make us self-sufficient financially. And so effectively a lot of choices have been made on what sells, what programs, academic programs are popular. And sometimes this could be at odds with what is intrinsically good for our society. Some of the other changes that we're all battling with at the moment is particularly the impact of government policy. We're all very aware that the relationship between the universities and the government is very strained, and the government is changing the policy settings and rules, which have profound implications for our work. For example, a real focus on STEM versus arts and humanities, and just thinking about what that might play out like in the workforce and the type of activities that we have if we end up with skewing of academic, whether it's right or wrong, where the funding's coming from. There's also greater competition in the market. There's swings and roundabouts in the sector. I've already heard of, with this reduced number of students, that there's people stealing students from each other. And there's all sorts of issues around reputation impact, but all these things in terms of attracting students, but this is not always straightforward. Some other reasons too is that some universities have made huge capital investments predicated on what they thought would be an ongoing pipeline of international students. And when that's dried up, they still have to pay for the buildings. So it may not be just directly related to international students in the short term. There's a whole bunch of other financial issues that are impinging on our universities. It's really interesting. People have predicted that some universities will go to the wall and others won't. But I've seen some quite interesting and different variations. And it seems also that those universities that have got very tight missions and are sticking to those missions are sort of doing better. And it could well be that some of the universities in the middle will struggle. Yesterday, the Times Higher Ed reported that nearly 2/3 of a survey of 1,100 UK academics said that the pandemic has led to their universities reprioritising teaching over research. And the authors have said that, quote, that this was especially salient in that 66% of the respondents were from research-intensive universities. And in Australia, in the past decade, we've diverted a lot of our library resources towards supporting research missions. And now what's happening is that the government is decoupling funding for teaching from research funding. So what that might mean in the long term into the sorts of library activities and roles that we have is a bit tricky. And I've got Brian Schmidt's photo on the screen because he was also quoted in the Times Higher Ed during the last week on what has been called the commoditised education gig economy. And Professor Schmidt said, quote, "There is a risk of people bypassing the foundational education they need in favour of short learning as you go training." So this is this sort of dilemma between sort of fundamental academic degrees versus a trend to micro-credentials, and we'll come to that more also in the Q&A as we go. And Brian Schmidt went on to say, quote, "What is the future of this ecosystem in a political world focused on the very short term, favouring training over education? and putting research-led education to the side. Next slide, please. When I was in the UK, SCONAL, which is sort of the UK equivalent of CORE, was very concerned about the future and the related workforce issues for their members. And so they commissioned this report from academics who were actually at the Librarianship School at Sheffield. And this is really great work. They researched, did extensive literature reviews, but they did a lot of interviews and surveys with a really wide range of stakeholders. And as an aside, I was particularly impressed by the relationship with academia and the profession through this report. And I wondered how often, we use library schools to help us in thought leadership. Quite often in Australia, it's been my experience that we tend to go to commercial consultants to conduct our research. And I will acknowledge the ALIA Professional Pathways report that says pertinently, quote, "We want to be partnering with our educators, not apart from them." So just to give you a very quick heads up on the report and the references at the end of my slides, which will be shared with you all later, but they identified 6 trends which are perhaps not surprising to all of us in higher ed libraries, but they do suggest some of the key knowledge and skills that we might be needing in the next 10 years. So I won't go through these. I think you will recognise some of them, but I found the report was really helpful in drawing those together. And these are what they call, there's 5 nexus, and this is the first 3. And then on the next slide, we've got some others. And these are very similar, interestingly, to some of those issues that I've just touched on about the political, economic environment that we work in, but also these things about blurred identities, which is, very much behind some of the conversations that we've been having around the profession. So if we go to the next slide, and this is from that report as well, and this is sort of a bit scary, and it looks at the professional skills that was thought that we would require in 10 years' time in our institutions. And it is perhaps cause for concern that the report says, quote, "Participants saw the future of library employment ambivalently. Library skills would still be relevant, but there would be fewer jobs." And that's the 3rd bar chart from the top. And this was borne out by more that's in the text of the report that you're welcome to look at later. But you can see on a positive aspect, I guess, there, when you look at adding together the agrees or strongly agrees, which is the blue bar at the top, and then agree, which is the yellow bar, you'll see that these sort of jobs, and this was perhaps the highest score, is that the value and skills of library professionals will still be relevant, but they will perhaps be more diverse and specialist. And as I said, the largest number of agrees suggests that there will be fewer jobs. And then also one of the other disturbing aspects in the report says that perhaps due to the seniority of our esteemed participants in the study was, quote, "Several participants commented on their difficulty in considering the future beyond their own retirement." Scary for me because this is probably my last job as well. But it would be interesting to see if younger professionals have a different and perhaps more positive vision of the future, particularly as we come to the Q&A shortly, but also to the debate on Thursday. So it'd be really good to hear perspectives from others. We go to the next slide, and this is just some thoughts about some of the future university library work. The SCONAL report identified strategic management, understanding the research process, relationship management, negotiation, and the user experience as the most critically important library skills. And this is sort of interesting because they're not the sort of skills that one would have thought as being vital to librarianship when I was a boy 20 years ago. In terms of future-facing roles, I think certainly one trend is very obvious, the emergence of UX, for example, and also thinking about some of our work here at Sydney. We have a graduate program, and we've been taking graduates from both information management and design computing courses. In terms of specialisation, we all know that as some libraries have, particularly research-intensive libraries, have grown their special collections and public programs, this requires specialist archival skills. And I think back to my time at the University of Melbourne when we hired a bunch of extra archivists to help us process the Germaine Greer archive. And then also there's been a growth in the need for marketing and event skills. And from my UK experience, a lot of the Arts Council and philanthropic funding is available not just to house and provide access to collections, but in fact, there's been a really strong push towards public programs to share these collections more widely, and particularly in the UK with widening participation of customers. And then the involvement of other professionals in our workforces and this is sort of one of the reasons why we're looking at pathways as well. And just as an example, my director of central services here at Sydney doesn't have a librarianship qualification, but she has both an MBA and a PhD. In terms of qualifications, I think back to what was sort of considered important as my career was developing and growing. At my time, I and a number of my other colleagues in librarianship went and did MBAs because that was considered to be an important addition to the fundamental library skill. But I also remember talking with Hero MacDonald, who's I think now the newest UL, about her career aspirations about 8 years or so ago. And in fact, when we talked, you know, she was thinking really IT was sort of an additional qualification that might be important, and she pursued that. And obviously that's helped her in her own career. And then just finally on flexibility, I think it's not just about skills and qualifications, but it's about things like emotional intelligence, leadership and team skills that are just as important as the technical skills. And then in my next slide, I'm just giving you a few of the new posts that we're creating at Sydney at the moment. Many of you have similar positions that are like these, but we are, as a result of a redundancy program, that's a voluntary program, we had the ability to let more people go, but we did trade-offs and created these new roles, which are quite exciting. And then I just want to finish with, you know, we've been talking a lot about courses and skills and whatever, but I think when it comes back to the fundamentals, I just came back to the ALIA Professional Values, because I just think that this sort of frames our approach to what the future workforce in ALIA, and you know, it obviously involves librarians and other people from different pathways who come together. And there's 10 of these values, and the next slide gives you the second half of those. So that's all my contribution for today, the next slide has some references that some of the reports, and there's 2 slides of the references, and they give you references to some of the work that I've cited today. So thanks very much, and look forward to some exciting conversation and questions soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Lots of changes happening and very insightful. Thank you for your presentation. And now to our final speaker, Kristy, over to you.
Thanks, Fiona. Hi, I'm Kristy. I'm the Digital Literacies Coordinator at the University of Wollongong. Just going to share my screen quickly. And like my fellow presenters, the name of the session was quite thought-provoking, but I think I maybe had less of a defensive reaction to it than some of the other presenters, where I looked at it and I thought, this could actually be really exciting, because I've spent a lot of time in my career really looking at how do I diversify. So I'm going to be looking at a bit more of a personal journey as we go through this, exploring some of the strategies and the mindsets that I've used to try and diversify my skills and embrace the changing world of libraries that I've worked within, as well as talking about my experiences in the Caval mentoring program, which I was a mentor last year. Before I go any further, I also just want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Dharawal country, which is Wollongong in New South Wales. It's a very beautiful land, and I feel very lucky to work at a library that really embraces those Indigenous knowledges and perspectives within our work and within our curriculum. So I'd like to pay my respect to those elders past, present and emerging. So just a little bit about me, just to get started, so that you know what kind of trajectory it might look like to have a diverse career. I am a qualified librarian, so I have a master's in library and information science. I did an undergraduate degree in English, and of course I went into a bookselling career after that, because the well-worn joke is that arts degrees really don't qualify you for a lot else but reading. So I went from working in a bookseller role, where I was working in, if you had watched Black Books, that would give you an idea of the kind of bookshop. It was very eclectic, very interesting, met lots of really great people, sold some amazing books. But in the end, I felt like I really wanted to pursue a career somewhere else. And I began studying my library qualification. I was then lucky enough to get a cadetship at the UOW Library, which was a 3-year program, and it enabled me to work across different areas of the library while also finishing my master's qualification. And I've always been really interested in professional development and looking at how we can contribute as library professionals to the kind of development of our careers, of our profession, of our workplace culture. So early in my cadetship, myself and a couple of the other cadets and a few other staff who were interested in this kind of thing also, we started something called the New Professionals Network, where we would get together and we would talk about issues that we thought were affecting the profession, how we wanted to react to those, where we thought our skills lay in relation to some of those issues. So it's always been something that's informed my practice in the back of my mind. After completing my cadetship, I moved into a liaison role, and I was teaching a lot of classes. So back then, the convention around liaison work was really to do lots and lots of information literacy instruction. But what that gave me was a really good grounding in how to communicate the value of the library to people who don't necessarily care what libraries can offer them. They just need that one particular piece of help that they need at that point in time. So I taught lots and lots of classes, mainly to students from a non-English speaking background, because I worked in an area that was a Pathways program. And it was a really, really good experience. And I think having that diversity of an audience to work with as well gave me an understanding of where some of the barriers could be and where some of our assumptions about our library content needed to be challenged. So language that we would use that we would think was completely intuitive, normal, easy to understand, was actually presenting barriers for some of these students because the terminology and the way we framed things just was alien to them. So I took that experience and I funneled that into my next kind of role, which was starting to look at exploring online learning spaces, working with things like the LMS, so Moodle is the one that we use here at UOW, and also looking at the online standalone resources that we create for student support. So lots of LibGuides, web pages, all that kind of thing. I was also starting to think about spaces outside library and what that could add to a library career and what else we needed to be bringing in to kind of strengthen the knowledge and the skills that we already had. And I got really interested and excited about design thinking. And I'm very fortunate that we have a very strong learning culture at UOW. So when I walked into our workforce planning manager's office and said, you know, I think there's something to this design thinking. I think this is something we can pursue. She gave me the go ahead to explore it. And so I did a facilitation course. I learned about design thinking through a couple of mechanisms. I then trained as a design thinking facilitator, and it ended up being training that we rolled out to all of our library staff. So that mindset of design thinking, that human-centered design work that we do, is now really part of our workplace culture. So I feel very fortunate to have been working in an organisation where those kinds of adjacent areas were welcomed and embraced. My role has also been really informed by project work, and I think this has added a real element of diversity as well. While I've always had a core job that I do, a lot of the work I've contributed to has been at a project level. So things like task and finish groups, creating websites, exploring particular initiatives. That's really been where I've found a lot of joy in my career and where I think a lot of my strengths have lie. I moved from a lot of that project work into really focusing on information and digital literacies. So obviously information literacy is a fairly core skill set for libraries, but we've moved into digital literacies as well as looking at that as really the new frontier of where information literacy is going in these days. We've done things like a framework, which, I mean, there are a lot of frameworks out there. Many universities have them. There's also the CABAL framework, so the core framework. And we've got a UOW one that is still going through that process of consultation as well. So I was fortunate to get heavily involved in that process and to really be able to drive it. And through that, I was able to gain a lot of experience in collaborating with people outside the library at a lot of different roles, and looking at liaising with staff at lots of different levels as well. So right up to the university executive level. And that's been a real growth experience and really positive. At the moment, I'm doing a lot of work around shaping some of the culture and development of the library staff within our institution. So we're looking at how we continue to strengthen that learning culture that we have within our staff workforce. So this is our library staff workforce. And then I'm also doing that work externally to the library, looking at how we can shape those digital literacies in particular, but some of those learning culture environments outside the library as well. So not a very straightforward career path, but it's always felt logical at the time. And I think a lot of that has to do with mindset and the way my mindset was geared towards always trying to look at what's next and how I could take what I already knew and transfer it into a new environment. So there's the catch cry that we all hear, which is, oh, you must get to read so many books being a librarian. And we know that library careers really aren't just about being able to touch the nice books and to read them. I wish that was the case some days, but you know, that's just not what we're working at. So these days, you're really commonly going to get qualified librarians working alongside people with marketing qualifications, IT, management. I was actually speaking to a colleague of mine who comes from a strong IT background, and he didn't realize prior to joining the library that librarian was a qualification outside someone who just is a library worker. So he just thought librarian meant you work in a library, not that it was a recognized degree. So I think we are very aware of what the librarian qualification means, but it's not always as obvious to those outside our space. And we know that things are changing in libraries as they are across the world. So the information we're managing is in different formats. We're really branching into space, library as place and space as being one of the things that we offer for value. And if I'm honest, libraries have been trying to redefine themselves or redefine what our relevance is since before I became a librarian. I've heard this so many times. What is the relevance of the library in the age of Google? And to be honest, I actually think we probably just need to move on from that discussion. We're still here, we're still thriving. If we can switch our mindset towards looking at, well, what's new and exciting in the next phase for us, rather than being overly concerned about how we're perceived, I think we're going to be just fine. Now, I found this great quote when I was researching for this presentation, and it's by some researchers in Canada, Klein and Lennart. One is not a librarian by virtue of an elegantly lofty job title or description, but rather by virtue of the numerous, messy, complex, and unique relations that emerge through interactions between librarians and library users. And I would say that's 100% true. I think that our profession is really evolving in relationship with the evolving environment around us. So if we're working in academic libraries, our users are mainly staff and students, and academic research staff, a whole different range of students as well. If we're working in public libraries, it's looking at the communities that we're servicing and the institutions we work within. But it's those interactions that really characterize where the library presents value in any given point in time. So there's information everywhere these days. Everyone's got a smartphone in their pocket. Everyone's got access to information, and it's really instantaneous. And I think the ease of that information, it really can give people the impression that, oh yeah, I don't need to look critically at this information, or this information is very easy for me to find. But when people really need to find something that's important, they continue to value our expertise in critically navigating this information landscape. We've also seen more focus on areas like digital dexterity, digital scholarship, research impact, open access and open research, knowledge management, content strategy, and UX in recent years. And as Philip just alluded to, a lot of those areas that came out in things like the Sectoral reports and those kinds of documents, they're not what we traditionally think of as library roles. So we probably couldn't have seen them coming if we had been trying to forecast 10 years ago. So what's next? What's in the next 10 years? And the truth is, you'll just never be 100% ready for it, but you can do your best to be prepared. So these are some of the strategies that I've used to try and prepare myself for this changing reality. I work to a model of what could be called active librarianship. So this isn't a new term. People have been saying this since at least the 80s. So well before I was a librarian, I was at school when people started discussing this. But what it actually means, I think, continues to evolve as our landscape does. So active librarianship looks like taking an evidence-based approach to your work, staying in touch with that literature and seeing what's out there, seeing what other institutions are doing, really engaging with the current movements, the current thoughts, trends, issues affecting our profession, and using that to inform your own practice. It also looks like engaging in professional learning networks and other PD opportunities. So the mentoring scheme was a fantastic one, which I'm going to speak about a little bit more. Continually reevaluating where we provide value as library staff, and then looking beyond the boundaries of the library that you work within. And I'm going to explore all of these in a little bit more detail. So professional learning networks are something which I've gained a lot of value from, and they can be as formal or as informal as you wish. In essence, what we're really talking about is just engaging with other people that share your area of interest. So this is anyone across the GLAM sector really, or it could even be people external to that. But what you're doing is you're building up connections with people for the purpose of sharing knowledge and facilitating those learning connections. They're frequently cross-institutional. They may be with other staff that you work with directly, but I find that these networks really flourish when they're mediated by technology and they can cross those institutional boundaries and physical location as well. So among my professional learning network, I would say there's people from all around Australia, from New Zealand, even a couple in the US. It's not something that's limited by the people I have access to physically in a physical space. They're a really good way to broaden your perspective and just continue to contribute to that professional dialogue as well. And I think it's important to always rethink our value. So the core business of libraries, it's pretty constant. We organise and we provide access to information resources in a whole range of formats. We provide reference, instruction and assistance, and then increasingly we're really providing spaces and technology. And then depending on the context of your library, there's going to be specialised skills that come into that as well. So things like research support, technology support, community engagement, they're all going to be core skills that you work with as well. But that doesn't mean that those skills are static. As the environment changes, as we're living within this changed environment, do those skills offer a different kind of value to the people that we're serving? And I think last year really gave us a great example of this. The resources that we provided probably didn't change, but the way people interacted with them or needed to interact with them really did, because the way that we were used to interacting with each other was so radically changed. So we had to think about what's the stuff that students or staff or our library clients really need when they're coming to us in the library, and how can we best provide that, knowing that it might not look the same way as it always did. And for many of us, we found that we were doing things that we'd always kind of wanted to do, but we'd never really had the courage, or we didn't think we had the space to do it. And 2020 forced us to turn that on its head and really get back down to what we saw as our core value and how we could deliver that to our communities. I would also encourage people to get collaborative. So look beyond your institution or your organisation. If you're only working inside your own team, it can get a little bit insular. You know each other very well. You end up sharing your opinions so often that you start thinking in the same way. So collaborating with staff from other library teams or from units within your institution or staff external to your institution, it's a really great way to broaden that perspective, and it gets you thinking outside the scope of your immediate environment. So what are those other teams or libraries doing that might benefit you and your work and the work that your library is doing? What are other industries doing that we could be embracing? So the previous presenters have alluded to things like marketing or IT as being core skills that we are bringing in from other areas. What else are these other industries doing that we could be repurposing for the library? And look for opportunities to expand your influence beyond your immediate work environment. So you could be the absolute expert in your field within your particular work area, but there's probably people at other institutions that would really benefit from hearing your perspective and understanding what kind of work you do and how that's affected the value you're providing. There's also a tendency to try and bridge a gap in the library, because we've gotten really used to evolving. We're stepping into all these new areas, and it's part of that whole dialogue around redefining the relevance of libraries. And I'll definitely say that in my experience so far, there's been areas where we'll step up because no one else is doing it, and we can, and we see the value, and we have the skills and the ability to do so. And this has some risks and it has some benefits. So the benefits are things like it allows for innovation and expansion, and it allows you to bring your professional perspective to contribute to a new arena. So you'll know that when you've spoken to people from outside your unit or outside your immediate work area, the multiple perspectives coming into that conversation really help you reach some new solutions and understand things in a new way. So it allows us to broaden what we're doing as libraries and as library workers, but it's also allowing others to know what libraries are now doing. The risks or the things to be careful around with this are that if you're moving into an area that maybe has unclear ownership or might be challenging some of those institutional structures, you do have to be mindful of not stepping on people's toes too much. So moving into the digital literacy area at UOW was something where this became highlighted, because there was little bits and pieces happening with this across the institution, but no one was really driving it in a coordinated way. And what we realized was that that wasn't our job to do either. We've taken a very collaborative approach working with those other units, but it's that emotional and social intelligence that you need to bring to those new directions that enable you to see what that pathway might look like. You also risk, I guess, and this is harking back to the theme of today's presentation, maybe diluting that value proposition of the library. If you're trying to do literally everything, then the library becomes, as a concept, becomes a little bit more meaningless. So I think there is an important thing where you need to be strategic about where you decide to put your energy in this way. Now, I'm going to just talk now about the mentoring partnership that I was part of as part of the Caval mentoring scheme last year. Mentoring is amazing. If you've not yet engaged in it, I really, really recommend it. I've been a mentee in a previous program, and then last year I was a mentor, and it's got a lot of benefits. So when we're thinking about how we redefine ourselves and how we diversify our profession for the future, things like mentoring are a super good tool. So for mentees, it's really beneficial because it helps you define areas for growth. It helps you kind of put a pin in a future direction that you might be interested in and also understand where your personal development opportunities are. It also helps you identify your personal strengths. What are you really good at? How do you optimize and maximize that? And when you're working with a mentor who doesn't know you outside that mentoring partnership, it gives you a really good objective perspective, which is helpful. Mentors can also provide a strategic perspective for mentees, because generally mentors are someone who is a little more advanced in their career than the mentee. So they can provide some perspectives of things from maybe a higher level in the institution, or from someone who just has more experience, being able to say, these are some things you should consider. These are some of the barriers or workarounds that I had to adopt when I've been in similar situations. And so the mentee is benefiting from all of that kind of conversation as well. And it just gets the mentee thinking critically about career development. So where is it that you want to go? What is it that you want to be in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? I don't know about you guys, but I find those questions really, really hard to answer off the top of my head. It's something that requires a lot of real deep thought, because you have to identify what your passion is, what your strengths are, where the industry is going, what kind of potential you have to come in and shape and contribute to that. For the mentor as well, mentoring relationships are really, really positive. So openly discussing that career experience and talking about those strategies, it can give you fresh perspective as a mentor on what may be quite an established career. And through the Caval program, there was also a lot of opportunity for me to connect with other mentors and build that professional network and kind of create a space for us to, we didn't mentor each other, but it was, we were working together in a professionally supportive environment. And it inspired me to take stock and recognize the value that I'd already built up over my career to date. And that in itself is something really valuable to do. One of the prompts that was given for today's session was also looking at whether the future of LIS mentoring would be more or less important as these discussions continue following the professional pathways and the sort of changes to the industry. And I would say, yes, it absolutely continues to be important, but that the way that partnership has traditionally worked might be slightly different. So there'll be more emphasis on transferable experience, I think, as the progression of these discussions continues. So there's fundamental issues that affect staff regardless of their area of expertise. And specialised expertise will always be relevant when a mentee is looking to move into a particular area, but it may not be the case that, well, I did this 5 years ago and this is how this worked. That kind of conversation isn't always going to be the way that you can support a mentee, because the landscape's going to look so different to what your history has looked like when you're a mentor. So I think that it can't be the only defining factor of, oh, here's some experience that I had that you can learn from. It's more like, here is an attitude that I can share with you. Here are some mindsets and some strategies that I've used that can transfer into different areas of experience and into a changing context to help the mentee get that development. And I had a former manager who once said to me, the only constant is change. And she's not the first person to say this. I'm sure she's not going to be the last person to say it, but it really is true. When you're moving through this career and looking at where the kind of landscape is shifting to, the only constant is that it's not going to stay the same. I think there's a misconception that librarianship is a fixed set of skills that is set in stone, and that's what it means to be a librarian. And, you know, I consider my practice to be really informed by my context. As a librarian, I identify as a librarian. It's really part of what shapes how I approach things. But I have to be aware that that context, that change will keep happening. That context is going to keep changing. So that's all I had. Hopefully I've not spoken too long. And I also look forward to the question session after this.
Thank you, Kristy. Well, I think everyone's engaging with active librarianship today through, there's a form of networking here, and certainly there's professional development here today. So thank you for your presentation as well. Okay, so I think we've hit a really rich vein of conversation and debate here. There are so many questions in the Slido Slido page. But I'm actually going to start with one of my own for Kristy, Trish, Philip, any one of you jump in for this. But it's going to be a bit of a double-barrel question. So what does the future look like for library and information science as a vocation, as a profession, and as an academic discipline? So we've got the three aspects there. There is a lot of crossover with other academic disciplines, so things like ICT and media. So I guess connected with that, do we have sufficient independent identity in librarianship? So first thing is, what does the future look like? And do we have sufficient independent identity?
I'll just say that, as Kristy's a good example, that you know, this whole issue about, is it a vocation, is it a profession? You know, I know so many people that have come in and out of what, you know, could be called traditionally a librarian's role, or working as a library worker. And so I just think that that's one of the healthy and exciting things about librarianship, that there is so many opportunities for people to go in different directions, and also to have many careers in the course of their overall career.
I want to pick up a couple of thoughts maybe very quickly. When Kristy sort of talked about the fact that, you know, people had been reinventing and thinking about libraries since the age of Google, and it was time we got over it, I was nodding along. And when I first took this job, one thing I said to Sue was, the one thing I was not going to do was talk about the future of the library profession, because the very first time I turned up in libraries, that's what we were talking about. And there's a moment where you're like, no, like the future is now, and we just get on with it, okay? And when you're talking about what is our identity, I come back, and thank you, Philip, for putting up the ALIA Professional Values, but I think actually encapsulated in that, and picking up from what Kristy was talking about with what the library does, that encapsulates the core of it. And the exact iteration of the skills will adapt as the environment changes, as the higher education environment changes, as the technological environment changes and turns into words that apparently I can't even pronounce. All of that will change, but if you want that solid core, that's where it sits. And that fundamental mission around what library and information services do has actually remained incredibly constant for a very long time. And the challenge is, how do we iterate that to make sure that the people working to provide those services can flourish and be supported?
Yeah, it's actually, Kristy, when you mentioned the constant change, I remember being, you know, looking at you know, fiction once upon a time was quite a controversial thing in libraries, and not having books change as shelves was also quite controversial. So there's been adaptation for quite a long time. Did you have any thoughts on identity or on the future, Kristy?
Oh, well, I think that my other presenters have covered it really well. And I would jump onto Trish's last point, that I think part of what we can do is really make sure that staff are supported to continue to flourish and develop as the context keeps changing. Because we know that change is going to be exciting, but also stressful. It's a real balance. And so staff need to feel supported to learn in an environment where they might fail sometimes along the way to that learning process, but that ultimately, if they continue to keep putting themselves out there and trying, that we are going to create something stronger at the end of that.
Thank you. Just looking at the Slido, and the questions do keep bouncing around a little as people keep voting on them, but one of the most popular questions at the moment is about whether it's a lesson that academic libraries are maybe shaped by the higher education sector dynamics more than the library profession dynamics. Do you have any thoughts on that?
We're all looking at you, Philip, to pick this one up first.
Yeah, no, look, I really agree, but I mean, to some extent we are quite specialised, and there are, you know, the sorts of specialised roles come about because of our size and our scope of our work. And, you know, for many years, you know, librarians have been part of the academic mission of the university, etc. And, you know, lots of my colleagues, I think, consider themselves to be, you know, quasi-academics. And that's also part of, you know, the excitement of working in the discipline. And I guess one of the nice things is that to do research is allowed in our careers. And, you know, it's always been right from my earliest days, it was always encouraged that we would give papers and, you know, go to conferences and share our knowledge. And, you know, certainly with my ALIA hat on as well, you know, it's really good that we can do practice-based research and share that in the profession as well. So I think that does make, you know, academic librarianship a little bit more special. But also, I think, you know, it's one of the nice things is to see people coming in and out of, particularly in the customer service area of university libraries, where we are not necessarily siloised. And, you know, some of our colleagues in the university library actually have come in from other parts of the university, student services, those sorts of activities. So, and that blurring, I think, gives some more excitement, and also the ability to have students as staff, because that's also really energising. You know, I'll never forget when we started that program at the University of Melbourne, and, you know, the other staff that were working around those students just loved them and picked up things. You know, they were learning as much from the students who are working with us as the other way around.
Yeah, yeah, I think certainly there are influences from a lot of different areas depending on the area that we're working in. So there's not just necessarily higher education, but, you know, other industry influences as well. And just connected to what you said about the students, yeah, students make you know, wonderful addition as employees. I actually want to connect that with a question about the role of cadetship. And Kristy, I'm going to direct this one to you. What do you see the role of it? Because, you know, cadets are usually studying as well as working, so they've kind of got the double-barreled experience and education happening right at the same time. So what do you see the role of cadets playing in the development of experience, and do you think they can replace formal education?
I think cadetships are really, it's a really positive way to come into the environment. And I found that the combination of on-the-job experience with the formal training that I was getting through my degree, it enhanced both of those areas. So I understood the content I was learning in my degree because I had somewhere practical to practice it and experience it and put that knowledge to use. I don't know if I'd like to see cadetships replace formal qualifications. I think there's definitely a place for learning things on the job, and I wouldn't want to block someone who's really flourishing in that sort of on-the-job environment by saying, oh, well, you don't have degree X, so therefore you can't work here. But I do think that there's so much value to exploring something in depth and being able to really engage with some of the issues that you learn as part of that degree and some of those fundamental skills. I think it comes back to context. I think that's where that really informs your practice, is all the contextual information you learn as part of the degree, why we do what we do, how all of these things fit together, what makes this a library skill rather than a skill that you might learn in another profession. I think that comes through the degree, and then the practical experience comes through the placement itself.
Thank you. So the next most popular question in Slido is someone just posing that there are only, I'm not sure if there's 2 or 3 higher education library information science courses left in Australia. Trish, you probably know off the top of your head exactly how many that is.
Yes. There are 3.
3? And the question is, how do we build diversity where there is a comprehensive devaluing of library and information science in Australia? So, Trish, do you have any thoughts on that question?
I think that the premise of constant devaluing of library and information science is interesting, and I'm not sure I completely agree with it. having been very in depth with some of the closures of the courses, there has been an awful lot of unexpected or potentially expected university politics. And I think what we're really seeing is a reaction to some of the external forces around universities and university funding to a large extent with some of them. And really interesting too. So for example, universities such as Monash that are currently in teach out of the specialisation, it may be the case that they still teach the courses that make up the specialisation. So there are interesting spaces, and it is definitely clear across a number of courses that the core skills, especially around information management, are very much valued within both the student marketplace and within the universities. So how exactly we work to make sure that we are harnessing that is one of the fundamental questions that we need to tackle.
I think also there's actually a couple of aspects here, and I think how diversity is viewed, and whether it's in the context of people or whether it's in the context of skill. And we've touched on both throughout all of your presentations in terms of diversification of skills, and us librarians or library workers being able to work in a whole host of different areas. And Kristy, what you were saying earlier about libraries, so often if no one else is taking care of something, librarians step on right in. So librarians step on right in. So yeah, that's certainly a lot for us to think about and to take away and contemplate. Just to follow on from that though, what do you see as the role of short courses and micro-credentials? Do they fill the gap that, as there are fewer opportunities for the more professional qualifications, do you think that micro-credentials can fill that gap?
So it'll be interesting to see how the micro-credential revolution pans out, to be honest. Like any new product, and they're educational products that comes onto the market, the packaging is one part of the puzzle and it's not the whole thing. I think there are different roles and different stages where we are looking at that micro-credential. I actually think the strongest demand for micro-credentials is around the continued professional development. And what micro-credentials give that the courses really don't give are the ability to quickly and flexibly respond to emerging issues with a tailored package for people, so that when the library does suddenly pick up ownership over data repositories, which is completely out of scope, or picks up pedagogy for teaching and learning, there is something that we're looking to fill in those gaps. So that's, I think, probably the strongest area where we see for micro-credentials. But we're also looking at what you can do with flexible delivery. And I think it will be interesting to see, and it will be interesting to work with our educational partners around things such as delivering course content, not in the traditional, you need to start off by enrolling in your full grad dip and do set courses, but are there entryways that look like stackable micro-credentials that lead people into those courses? And I think the more library and information pathways we get, and the more we manage to get skills into the hands of the people who need them, the stronger we will be as an entire service and as a profession.
Yeah, which again goes back to what you were saying earlier about lifelong learning and what we learned in our degrees or graduate diplomas or certificates or whatever pathway we come through is not. It's things don't stay static. And as a health librarian, this is also something that's very important in the health professions. That if your doctor is only relying on what they learned 30 years ago, then they're missing out on a lot of information.
Yeah, I'd agree that there's huge potential for micro-credentialing as a way to continue that professional development. And if you think about a degree, it's a stacked micro-credential. It's a bunch of subjects that you tie together and you build a qualification out of that. So if we were to reframe the way we think about micro-credentialing, I think that would be really beneficial too, because there's a bit of a perception that it's less than, a degree, but if you can combine all of those pieces of, I guess they're more specialized bits of knowledge because you're focusing more on a particular area, I think it actually enhances your professional status.
Yeah.
And I also look to the micro-credentials as a way of, the people that come in to work in our libraries that don't have a librarianship background, where they can get some of those underpinning essentials. I don't see micro-credentials, as the Brian Schmidt example of replacing deep learning and thinking that you get through an extended, undergraduate or postgraduate degree. But, if you've got that underpinning and then stack some on top of, and so particularly for some of those people that don't have a librarianship background, but we can have courses in the values, the ethics and all those sorts of things.
Philip, the next most popular question is actually related to the new jobs at University of Sydney, and that all of them don't require a library qualification. So, so this question is asking about what that says about the fate of library and library and information science courses. So I think this has probably already been touched on, but Philip, did you have anything extra that you wanted to add about that?
Yeah, I'd just say that that's a bit of an assumption that librarians wouldn't be able to apply for those jobs, and I already know of a number of librarians who are interested in those sorts of jobs.
I think the question is more about that they don't actually require a library qualification. So people that don't have a library qualification can apply. I think that's my interpretation of what's going on.
Yeah. I guess it's a back to front sort of interpretation, but again, I think it's particularly some of staff who come in from, diverse degrees, but have also worked in libraries would be, in the same way that many of our academic librarians don't have a teaching degree, but they, work in very intensive educational roles. That's why I see it as, opportunities rather than a threat.
And the next question is, oh, sorry, everything's jumped around a little. So it is a question, and I think this was actually posted during Trish's presentation, and it's about pathways for people with diverse degrees that might not be in LIS, and sort of making the point that surely that is of huge value to the profession.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
and that's one of the things that Professional Pathways is really looking at is people who've come in from diverse backgrounds. I mean, my background was law. I fell into libraries through copyright reform.
Yeah.
So, I've got this vested interest in bringing some of those other skill sets in, but then also making sure we shoehorn some of that essential library and information knowledge, because it's one thing to be able to bring those in, but at the same stage, there is the way that library services envision and order and provide access to that whole knowledge ecosystem is quite important. And I think possibly all of us at various stages of the years have seen what happens when some very well-meaning IT guy or somebody comes in and just simplifies things in a way that doesn't have sympathy with some of the big structural issues. So it's just making sure that we can harness the fantasticness of the skills, but still keep the sort of the integral qualities, I guess.
Actually, one of my next questions, again, I think this has already been covered off, but that our profession is so incredibly diverse, both across and also within sectors, which I think we've already mentioned with the higher education sector. And I was actually going to pose whether one degree could possibly prepare graduates for all possible roles they might have in the future, but I think you've already covered that off, and that would be a no. And that's why lifelong learning is so important.
And I think, and this too, by the way, is the bit where every now and then I go on a slight grumpiness when people talk about job-ready graduates, as if you can just pick somebody up out of a degree and expect them to know everything hitting the ground, because you can't do it. And that's not what a degree is meant to do either. What it's meant to do is give you the skills that you can learn and you can find the solutions and you can get up to speed. But it's not a to-do list of knowing how to do every particular thing, and it could never be that.
I totally agree. And I think Philip said it before, where it's the degree gives you an opportunity for deep thinking and critical engagement. And that doesn't necessarily make you able to walk into a workplace and be able to catalogue a book straight away, or to know how to design a library system, or to do any of the things we do in our jobs. But yeah, I agree. That job ready thing really irks me as well.
Are you going to defend job ready? Philip, we can have a nice fight.
So,
well, I mean, my career, I mean, was I ever job ready? I don't know. I said to someone earlier today, if I ever stopped going to meetings, I'd have to be retrained.
Well, it implies, I think, like the job ready thing implies that there's a static environment that you can be completely ready for, and you never are. You know, you can teach every critical library skill in the world and walk into a workplace the next day and still encounter something you don't know how to do yet, because the context and the environment keeps changing.
Absolutely.
that's what job ready.
It's a good grounding, but
maybe that's what job ready actually means, that you're ready to walk in and adapt and learn and continue to explore. We are just about out of time. I think there are so many benefits to diversity and inclusivity to our workplaces, and I think, you know, we've touched on so many different things and potential pathways to go to account for all different backgrounds and different ideas and different approaches to work in libraries. Thank you, Trish, Philip and Kristy, for sharing all your fantastic insights and projects and experiences. And thanks also to everyone who asked questions and attended. I'm so sorry I only managed to get through a couple of the questions. I think that they're still coming in. There's so many of them. So absolutely there's more to discuss. But I'd like to thank the CRIG and the PDIG committees for organising the event, especially Marion Slawson from Federation University, Naomi Mullumby from the University of Melbourne, and Craig Patterson from Deakin University, who are all also part of the planning group. And feel free to contact the speakers with any further questions you may have after the webinar. So Kristy, Philip and Trish, you may wish to check your inboxes afterwards. I think you might be getting a few questions.
Excellent. I'm up for Twitter debates too.
yep, me too.
Sarah, if you could just pop the email into the chat box so people can grab it, but it's members@cabal.edu.au. I also just want to mention that CRIG, PDIG and Cabal are continuing the initiative started in 2020 and have arranged for native trees to be planted through the organisation 15 trees as a thank you to our speakers. And just finally, a reminder that our next webinar is held this Thursday, 27th of May from 2 till 3 o'clock, and that's Australian Eastern Standard Time. And that webinar takes the shape of a debate where team experience and team education debate the importance of an LIS education versus professional work experience when working in the library. We look forward to seeing as many of you on Thursday as possible, and thank you everyone.